Caleb Thorne believed in three things: the heft of his axe, the unerring aim of his rifle, and the profound, inviolable sanctity of solitude. The Montana Territory, in the heart of winter, was a fine enforcer of that belief. It scoured a man down to his essentials, freezing away the unnecessary parts of him, the memories, the regrets, the ghosts of men he could not save. The blizzard that descended from the mountains this close to Christmas was not a storm. It was a judgment, a physical manifestation of the cold he had cultivated inside himself for the 6 years since Appomattox. It howled like a wounded animal, a sound he understood better than the chatter of any town. He was checking his Wester trap line, the wind a physical blow against his shearling-lined coat. The snow was not falling but flying, a horizontal torrent of ice that stung his exposed cheeks. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Boulder, stamped and snorted, his trust in Caleb warring with his animal instinct to flee. "Easy, boy," Caleb muttered, his voice swallowed by the gale. "Just one more to check." It was a fool's errand in this weather, but routine was its own kind of fortress. Routine kept the thinking at bay. That was when he saw it. A patch of color against the consuming white. A stain of deep blue, almost black, half buried in a fresh drift near a copse of skeletal aspens. It was wrong. The winter landscape was a stark palette of white, gray, and the dark green of the pines. Blue did not belong. His first thought was of a fallen blanket from a passing wagon, but no one in their right mind would be on this trail. Not now. Curiosity, an emotion he had long since tried to starve, won out. He nudged Boulder forward, the horse fighting every step. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not a blanket. It was a woman's coat, and there was a person inside it. A slender form, face down, one gloved hand flung out, as if reaching for something that was not there. For a long, frozen moment, Caleb did nothing. He just sat in his saddle, the wind screaming around him, a cold far deeper than the weather seeping into his bones. His mind, a practical and brutal machine, calculated the odds. She was likely already gone, frozen solid, and if by some miracle she was not, what then? Bringing her back to his cabin was an invitation. It was a breach of the walls he had so painstakingly built. A person brought complications. A woman, he imagined, brought a particular kind of complication he was wholly unequipped for. The solitude he had fought for, bled for in his own way, would be shattered. He could turn Boulder around. No one would ever know. The snow would finish its work, and she would become another secret the mountains kept. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But then the wind died for a brief second, a sudden, shocking silence, and in that quiet he saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her back. She was breathing, and the ghosts of the men he had failed, the ones who stared at him in the dead of night, rose up in his memory. He had turned his back on the world of men, but his own code of honor was a sterner master. It did not permit leaving a person to die. He swore, a harsh, bitter sound lost to the returning wind. He dismounted, sinking to his knees in the deep snow. He rolled her over gently. Her face was pale as alabaster, lips tinted a frightening shade of blue. Lashes thick with ice were fanned over her cheeks. She was young, younger than he was, and her face, even in this state of near death, held a stubborn sort of dignity. He pulled off his thick leather glove and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. The pulse was a faint, thready flutter, a desperate bird trapped in a cage of ice. She was alive. He worked quickly, his movements economical. Untying the bedroll from behind his saddle, he wrapped her in the thick wool blanket first, then maneuvered his own heavy coat around her small frame. She was lighter than he expected. Lifting her was no effort at all. As he settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolled back against his chest. The contact was a jolt, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was alien and unwelcome. He wrapped the reins around his fist and urged Boulder toward home. The horse, now tasked with a purpose he understood, moved with new resolve. Caleb held the woman tight against him, her inert form a fragile burden. He looked down at her still face, the snowflakes melting on her skin. The date, which he usually ignored, surfaced in his mind. It was 2 days before Christmas, a day for miracles and other such nonsense he no longer believed in. And yet, here he was, a half-frozen woman in his arms, riding into the teeth of a blizzard that should have been his sole companion. A dry, humorless thought, sharp as a shard of ice, cut through his mind. He bent his head against the wind, his lips close to her ear, though he knew she could not hear him. "You're my Christmas miracle," he whispered, the words a strange, bitter prayer into the storm. Eliza Wentworth awoke to the sensation of warmth. It was a slow, creeping thing, like dawn spreading over a frozen field. It started in her toes and fingers, a painful tingling that blossomed into a deep, aching heat. The second thing she registered was the smell, wood smoke, coffee, and something savory that made her stomach clench with a hunger so profound it was almost nauseating. She was lying on something soft, a straw mattress by the feel of it, and covered by a mountain of heavy wool blankets and what felt like a cured animal hide. Her eyes fluttered open. The light was dim, golden, cast from a stone fireplace where a healthy fire crackled and spat. The room was small, a single space built of sturdy, axe-hewn logs. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. Shelves lined one wall, neatly stacked with tins and jars. A rifle and a shotgun were mounted above the mantelpiece. It was a man's space, Spartan, orderly, and fortified. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in her throat. She remembered the snow, the endless, blinding white, the exhaustion that had finally dragged her down, making the prospect of sleep in a snowdrift feel like a warm invitation. She remembered fleeing the stagecoach station in Bozeman, her supposed protector revealing himself to be one of Judge Alastair Barrett's men. She had run, with only the small satchel she carried and the clothes on her back. She had run until she could run no more. A man stood with his back to her, tending a pot over the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements economical and sure. He wore a simple flannel shirt, the fabric stretched taut across his back. He seemed unaware that she was awake. This was her rescuer, the man who had pulled her from the snow. She assessed him with the practiced caution of a woman who had recently learned that trust was a costly commodity. He was a stranger, and she was in his home, utterly at his mercy. He turned then, as if sensing her gaze, and their eyes met. His were the color of a winter sky, a startlingly pale gray, and they held no readable expression. His face was lean, all hard angles and planes, framed by dark, unruly hair and shadowed by a day's growth of beard. He was not handsome in the polished way of the man she had known in Boston, but there was a raw, compelling power in his stillness. "You're awake," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Eliza pushed herself up on her elbows. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Where am I?" "My cabin," he said, ladling a thick stew into a wooden bowl. "You were half frozen about 3 miles west of here." He walked to the bedside and held out the bowl. He did not offer help as she struggled to sit up, but he waited patiently until she had. "Eat. It's venison." The stew was hot and rich, and with every spoonful, she felt life seeping back into her limbs. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of her spoon against the bowl. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not menacing either. It was watchful. "I am in your debt," she said, her voice stronger now. "You saved my life." He gave a short, non-committal nod and turned back to the fire. "The storm has us pinned. Could be days. Days." The word hung in the air. Days trapped in this tiny cabin with this silent, formidable man. The thought should have terrified her. It did a little, but the alternative had been freezing to death. "My name is Eliza Wentworth." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Caleb Thorne." He offered nothing more, and she did not press. She finished the stew, the simple food more satisfying than any of the elaborate meals she had eaten at her father's table. When she was done, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her own clothes, a practical wool dress and underthings, were hanging on a line near the fire, dry and warm. She felt a flush of embarrassment, realizing he must have undressed her. But she also noted that she had been woken wearing a large flannel shirt that was certainly his, a gesture of propriety that eased her mind. "I cannot be a burden," she announced, her voice firm. "I will earn my keep until the storm passes." Caleb looked at her, one eyebrow raised in faint surprise. He had expected tears, or hysterics, or the delicate fainting of an Eastern lady. He had not expected this quiet, resolute declaration. He had seen her clothes, the fine wool and delicate stitching. She was a woman of quality, unaccustomed to hardship. "There's not much to do," he said flatly. "I can cook. I can mend," she insisted, gesturing toward a tear in the sleeve of the shirt he was wearing. "I am more capable than I might appear, Mr. Thorne." He considered her for a long moment. He saw the pride in her eyes, the steel beneath the refined exterior. It was that same stubborn dignity he had seen in her half-frozen face. It intrigued him. It was also a complication. He wanted her to be a fragile thing he could deposit in the nearest town and forget. This woman, he suspected, would not be easy to forget. "My mending kit is on the shelf," he said, turning away. "Do as you please." It was a dismissal, but for Eliza, it was a victory. She found a small tin box with needles and thread. She took one of his spare shirts, it seemed strained, and sat in the chair by the fire. The cabin was quiet again, but the silence had shifted. It was no longer just the silence of one man's solitude. It was the shared quiet of two people in a small room, each acutely aware of the other's presence, the storm outside locking them together in an unwelcome intimacy. Caleb watched her out of the corner of his eye. Her stitches were small and even, her hands moving with a practiced grace that was at odds with the rough frontier setting. He had rescued a lady, that much was clear, but as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, he began to suspect he had brought more than just a body into his fortress. He had brought a will as strong as his own. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. The blizzard raged without pause, cocooning the small cabin in a world of white and wind. Caleb would rise before dawn, his movements quiet, and tend to the fire. He would go out for short, brutal stints to feed Boulder in the lean-to and chop more wood from the massive pile stacked against the cabin's eastern wall, returning each time caked in snow, the cold clinging to him like a shroud. Eliza would have coffee ready, hot and black, the way he seemed to like it. She had discovered his small stash of beans and a grinder, and the morning ritual of filling the cabin with its rich aroma became her first contribution. She organized his shelves, cooked their meals from his stores of dried meat, beans, and flour, and mended every piece of his clothing that showed the slightest wear. She was a quiet, efficient presence, and Caleb found himself grudgingly impressed. She did not complain about the cramped quarters, the simple food, or the lack of amenities. She simply did what needed doing, with a quiet competence that belied her fine-boned features. He found himself watching her. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough for biscuits, her fingers surprisingly strong and deft. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration when threading a needle. He watched the firelight catch the reddish glints in her dark brown hair when she sat near the hearth in the evenings. These observations were dangerous. They were cracks in a wall of his detachment, letting in flickers of a life he had forsaken. He felt a growing unease, a sense that her presence was methodically dismantling the defenses he had spent years perfecting. Eliza, in turn, watched him. She saw the way he moved, with a predator's grace and economy of motion. She saw the deep, abiding sadness that settled in his eyes when he thought she was not looking, a shadow that the firelight could not touch. He spoke little, his words practical and to the point, but she was beginning to learn the language of his silences. She saw the care he took with his tools, the gentleness with which he spoke to his horse. He was a hard man, forged by a hard life, but there was no cruelty in him. She felt safe, a sensation so foreign and precious it felt like a dream. The storm broke on the fourth night. The wind died down, and a profound silence fell over the land, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire. They had just finished their supper of rabbit stew and biscuits, sitting at the small table. The quiet felt different now, less a truce and more an invitation. The trail to town should be passable in a day or two, Caleb said, his voice sounding loud in the stillness. He was staring into his empty bowl, not looking at her. The words were a statement of fact, but they felt like a pronouncement, an ending. A knot of anxiety tightened in Eliza's chest. Town, civilization, the world where Judge Barrett was waiting. The safety of his cabin was a temporary illusion. I see, she said, her voice small. Caleb finally looked up, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the fear she was trying to hide. He had been so focused on the disruption to his own life that he had given little thought to what she was running from. He had respected her privacy, not asking the questions that hung in the air between them. But now, the prospect of sending her back into whatever danger she had fled pricked at that long-dormant part of him that once wore captain's bars. "You're in some kind of trouble, Eliza," he stated, using her first name for the first time. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. The kindness in his tone, however rough, was her undoing. The story she had held back, the fear she had swallowed, came spilling out. "My father," he made a promise. A business arrangement that he could not honor. Her voice was low, laced with a shame that was not hers to bear. "To settle the debt, he promised me in marriage to a man named Judge Alistair Barrett." She said the name as if it were a curse. "I met him once. He is a cold man, possessive. He looked at me not as a person, but as a prize he had won. My father died 2 months ago, and the judge sent for me. He holds the debt over my family's estate. To refuse is to ruin my mother and sisters. But to agree," she trailed off, unable to voice the horror of that future. "I could not do it. I took what money I had and fled Boston. I thought I could disappear out here. Become a teacher, perhaps. But his reach is long. He had men waiting for me in Bozeman. I ran." Caleb listened, his expression hardening as she spoke. He knew of Judge Barrett, a man who owned most of the freight contracts in the territory, a man whose power and influence were spoken of in hushed, resentful tones, a man who used the law as his personal cudgel. Her story resonated with his own disgust for men who used power to crush others. He saw not a delicate lady, but a soldier fighting a desperate battle on her own. "He won't stop," Caleb said, his voice flat. "A man like that, his pride is at stake." A single tear traced a path down Eliza's cheek, and she wiped it away angrily. "I know." The sight of that tear, and her fierce effort to hide it, broke something open in him. He felt an unwelcome surge of protectiveness, hot and sharp. He looked into the fire, the flames dancing over the stone. He had come to these mountains to forget a war, to be free of responsibility for other lives. But this felt different. This was not a cause or a country. It was one woman, sitting in his home with nowhere else to go. "I was a captain," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He had not spoken of it in years. "In the Union Army. At Cold Harbor." He did not need to say more. The name of the battle was a synonym for slaughter. "I led my company in charge. Gave an order that sent 74 men into a wall of fire. I was one of the handful who walked away." He fell silent, the ghosts of those men filling the space between them. "I came out here because I was done with giving orders that got people killed. Done with being responsible for anyone but myself." Eliza looked at him, her own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. She finally understood the sorrow in his eyes. It was the crushing weight of guilt. He had built this fortress of solitude not to keep the world out, but to keep his own ghosts in. They were two different kinds of fugitives, hiding from two different kinds of pasts. "You survived, Caleb," she whispered. "That is not a crime." His gaze snapped to hers. No one had ever said that to him. They had called him a hero, a survivor, a lucky one. But no one had ever looked at the guilt he carried and simply absolved him. In her eyes, he did not see pity, but a profound and startling understanding. A connection was forged in that moment, silent and unbreakable, there in the warm, fire-lit heart of the storm. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface of their polite cohabitation now had a name. It was recognition. He saw her strength, and she saw his wounds. He found himself looking for excuses to be near her, his shoulder brushing hers as they passed in the cramped space, the contact sending a jolt through his system. He noticed the scent of her, a clean, subtle fragrance of soap and woman that was beginning to feel like a part of his home. One evening, he watched as she struggled to brush out her long, thick hair, which had become tangled during her ordeal and the subsequent days. She worked at a particularly stubborn knot with a small travel comb, her frustration evident. The next day, he said nothing, but after his chores were done, he sat by the fire with a block of aspen wood and his sharpest knife. Eliza watched him from the corner of her eye, curious. For 2 nights, he worked, the blade moving with practiced precision, peeling away slivers of pale wood. On the 3rd night, he finished. He had carved a comb. It was simple, unadorned, but the wood was sanded smooth as glass, the teeth perfectly spaced and tapered. He stood up, walked over to where she sat reading a worn copy of Shakespeare she had found on a shelf, and placed it in her hand without a word. Eliza looked down at the comb, then up at him. His face was impassive, but his gray eyes were fixed on hers, a question in them. It was the most thoughtful, tender gesture she had ever received. It was not a jewel bought to impress, but a thing made, crafted by his own hands to meet a need he had observed. It was an admission that he saw her, that he cared. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time she did not try to hide them. "Thank you," she breathed, her fingers closing around the smooth wood. Caleb gave a short, stiff nod and retreated to his side of the room, his heart pounding a loud, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He was in trouble, deep trouble. This woman, with her quiet strength and her understanding eyes, was breaching his defenses one by one. And the most terrifying part was, he was no longer sure he wanted her to stop. The thaw came with a suddenness that felt like a betrayal. The relentless wind ceased, and the sun, a stranger for nearly a week, appeared pale and watery in the sky. The world outside the cabin's small window was transformed into a glittering expanse of white, beautiful and treacherous. For Caleb, the silence of the post-storm world was more menacing than the blizzard's roar. It meant the roads would clear. It meant the world and all its dangers could now reach his door. He spent the day clearing a path to the lean-to and checking the roof of the cabin for damage. He worked with a grim, focused energy, trying to sweat out the tension coiling in his gut. Every so often, he would find his gaze drifting to the window, to the silhouette of Eliza moving inside. She had become a part of the landscape of his life in a few short days, and the thought of this landscape being empty again left a hollow ache in his chest. He was a man who had craved solitude, and now the thought of it felt like a punishment. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the sharp peaks of the western range, he heard the sound he had been dreading, the jingle of harness and the crunch of hooves on snow. 2 riders were making their way up the track to his cabin. They were not neighbors. They rode with the arrogant slouch of men for hire, their hands resting near the butts of the pistols on their hips. "Stay inside," Caleb said, his voice low and urgent as he stepped through the door. "And stay quiet." Eliza's face went pale. She had been humming softly while kneading bread, a domestic sound that now seemed horribly out of place. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear, and shrank back from the window into the deeper shadows of the cabin. Caleb closed the door and stood on his small porch, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not reach for his gun. That was an invitation. But his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, his body a coiled spring. The riders reined in a few yards from the cabin, their horses blowing steam in the frigid air. The man in the lead was thick-set, with a florid face and small, mean eyes. "That's far enough," Caleb said, his voice carrying with quiet authority in the still air. The lead rider smirked, a greasy, unpleasant expression. "We ain't looking for trouble, friend. Just information. We're looking for a woman. Came through here from Bozeman a few days back. Dark hair, fancy clothes. Answers to the name of Eliza Wentworth." Caleb's expression did not flicker. He let the silence stretch, his gaze flat and cold. He was measuring them, and they knew it. Haven't seen anyone. The storm had this valley locked up tight for a week. That's so, the second man, a leaner, more weaselly type, chimed in. Funny. We tracked her to the old trail junction down below before the snow hit. This is the only homestead for 20 miles in this direction. Inside, Eliza held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear their voices, muffled but clear. She pressed herself against the rough log wall, praying for invisibility. Caleb shrugged, a gesture of complete indifference. A fool in a blizzard can get you lost anywhere. Maybe the wolves found her. The casual brutality of the suggestion was deliberate. He was showing them the kind of man they were dealing with. The thick-set man's eyes narrowed. He scanned the cabin, his gaze lingering on the curtained window. The judge, Mr. Barrett, he's offering a handsome reward for her return. $100. I don't need his money, Caleb said. His tone was final. It was a dismissal. The riders exchanged a look. They had been sent to retrieve a runaway woman, not to get into a gunfight with some grim-faced mountain man on his own ground. Caleb looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself, and his stillness was more intimidating than any open threat. If you see her, you send word to Bozeman, the lead rider grunted, pulling on his reins to turn his horse. The judge gets what he wants. Caleb watched them ride away until they were small specks against the snow. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax. He had stood his ground. He had lied for her. He had thrown his lot in with hers, and there was no going back. The protective lie felt more binding than any contract. He turned and went back inside. Eliza was standing exactly where he had left her, her face a mask of terror and relief. They're gone, he said. For now, she whispered. He won't give up. That man. The judge gets what he wants, he will be back. Caleb knew she was right. Those men would report back that they thought the mountain man was lying. Next time, it wouldn't be 2 hired guns. It would be Barrett himself, and he would likely come with the law, or his version of it, on his side. They were no longer just sheltering from storm. They were preparing for a siege. He walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames, his mind racing. He had faced down cannon fire and cavalry charges, but this was a different kind of war. This was a war of wits and legal maneuvering against a powerful and scrupulous man. Eliza was vulnerable. Her word against the judges meant nothing. She had no standing, no protection. He turned to face her, his decision made. It was a desperate, crazy plan, a gambit board necessity, but it was the only one he had. They were right about one thing, he began, his voice low and serious. Barrett has the law on his side. He can claim you're a fugitive from a contract. He can have the sheriff in his pocket issue a warrant. Then what can I do? Eliza asked, her voice trembling. Where can I go? Nowhere, Caleb said bluntly. Not as Eliza Wentworth. He took a breath, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. But he has no claim on another man's wife. His power, his warrants, they can't touch a married woman being sheltered under her husband's roof. The law protects that. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. You should marry me. The proposal hung in the silent cabin, as stark and shocking as a gunshot. Eliza stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. Marry him? This quiet, haunted stranger? It was preposterous. It was a solution from a penny dreadful novel, not a strategy for real life. And yet, she saw the cold, hard logic in it. As Eliza Wentworth, she was prey. As Mistress Caleb Thorne, she would be protected by a legal and social fortress that even a man like Barrett would find difficult to breach. But a flicker of the defiance that had made her flee Boston in the first place rose up. She had run from one marriage of convenience that would have made her a man's property. She would not simply trade one cage for another, no matter how well-intentioned the jailer. You would do that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. For a stranger? You're not a stranger, Caleb said, and the simple admission seemed to cost him something. And Barrett is the kind of man I've had my fill of. It was a practical matter, he told himself. a strategic move. But as he looked at her, at the way the firelight softened the proud lines of her face, he knew it was more than that. The thought of those men putting their hands on her, of Barrett claiming her, had ignited a fury in him he hadn't felt in years. Eliza's mind raced. It was a shield, a temporary arrangement to ensure her survival. But the word marriage was a heavy one, freighted with meaning. She thought of the comb he had carved, the quiet way he made sure she was warm, the story of his past he'd shared. This was not a man like Alistair Barrett. This was a man of honor. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his with a new resolve. "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will accept your proposition, but on one condition." Caleb's eyebrow quirked. He had expected either a grateful acceptance or a horrified refusal. He had not anticipated a negotiation. "What condition?" "This cannot be another lie," she said firmly. "I will not be a piece in a strategic game, even for my own protection. I will not live a falsehood. If we do this, if I take your name, it must be a real marriage, a partnership. We will be equals in this home. We will build a life here, together, not just until the threat of Judge Barrett is gone, but for good." She took a breath, her heart pounding at her own audacity. "I will be your wife, Caleb Thorne." Not just a name. He was stunned into silence. He had offered her a shield, and she had demanded a life. He had proposed a temporary fiction, and she had countered with a permanent truth. It was everything he had run from: connection, responsibility, a future entwined with another's. It was terrifying, and yet, as he looked at her standing there, so fierce and proud and vulnerable, a part of him that he thought was long dead yearned for it. A partnership, a life, a home that was more than just a fortress. A long moment passed. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "A partnership," he repeated slowly, tasting the word. He gave a single, decisive nod. "All right, Eliza. A partnership." The journey to the town of Clearwater was a tense and silent affair. Caleb had determined it was their best option. It was a small, rugged mining town 50 miles south, far enough from Bozeman's sphere of influence that he hoped Barrett's reach would be weaker. The justice of the peace there, a man named Henderson, was known to be an independent soul. And more importantly, Clearwater had a sheriff, a man Caleb knew by reputation. Angus Brody, a former lawman from Texas who was said to be gruff but scrupulously fair. They rode double on Boulder, Eliza seated behind Caleb, her hands resting lightly on his waist. The physical contact was a constant, unnerving reminder of the monumental step they were about to take. With every mile they covered, the reality of her condition, of her demand for a real marriage, settled more heavily upon him. He could feel the warmth of her through his coat, sense the rhythm of her breathing. He had offered his name as a shield. He had not fully comprehended that he was also offering his life. Eliza, for her part, was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Fear of Barrett Ward with the terrifying hope that this audacious plan might actually work. She was placing her entire future in the hands of a man she had known for less than a week. Yet, as she held on to him, feeling the steady strength in his back, she did not feel regret. She felt a fragile, burgeoning trust. This man had shared his ghost with her. He had lied for her. He was willing to bind his life to hers to keep her safe. It was more than anyone had ever done for her. They arrived in Clearwater as dusk was painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The town was little more than one muddy main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, and the sheriff's office. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the sound of a poorly played piano drifted from the saloon. Caleb dismounted and helped Eliza down, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll find Sheriff Brody first," he said, his voice low. "It's better he hears it from us." Sheriff Brody's office was a small, cluttered room that smelled of stale coffee and damp wool. The sheriff himself was a bear of a man, with a thick gray beard and shrewd, watchful eyes. He listened without interruption as Caleb laid out a heavily edited version of the story. That Eliza was a woman he was courting, that a powerful man from back east was trying to force a prior claim on her, and that they wished to be married immediately to put an end to the matter. He did not mention that they had only just met. Brody leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. He studied Caleb, then let his gaze drift to Eliza, who stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He had seen enough trouble in his 60 years to recognize it when it walked through his door. He also knew a liar when he saw one, and while the story was full of holes, he sensed a fundamental truth beneath it. The fear in the woman's eyes was real, and the protective stance of the man was not an act. He also knew Judge Barrett's reputation. "Henderson, the justice, is over at the saloon playing poker," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "He won't be happy about being interrupted, but he'll do it for $5. He paused, his eyes locking with Caleb's. "I'll stand as your witness. That way, it's all official and on the record. If this man Barrett comes sniffing around Clearwater, his first stop will be me, and I'll have a signed and witnessed marriage certificate to show him." Relief washed over Caleb. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," Brody grumbled, heaving himself to his feet. "You're borrowing trouble, son. A man like Barrett doesn't give up easy. Now let's go get you hitched before Henderson loses all his money." The ceremony was as stark and unromantic as it could possibly be. Justice Henderson, a balding man reeking of whiskey, performed the service in a back room of the saloon, the sound of laughter and the piano filtering through the thin walls. He read the words from a tattered book in a bored monotone. Caleb and Eliza stood before him, with Sheriff Brody as their sole audience. Caleb's hand, when he took hers, was rough and calloused but surprisingly warm. Eliza's was trembling. When she spoke her vows, her voice was clear and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hand. When Caleb spoke his, the words were quiet but firm, a solemn oath. "All right, that's that," Henderson said, closing the book with a snap. He scribbled his name on the certificate. "By the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you man and wife." He paused, looking from one to the other. "Well, you can kiss her, Thorne. It's legal." An awkward, charged silence fell over the room. Caleb looked at Eliza, his wife. The word was a cannon shot in the quiet of his mind. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her eyes wide and dark. This was the moment her condition became real. This was the seal on their partnership. Slowly, he leaned in. He was clumsy, uncertain. He had not kissed a woman in almost a decade. He intended to brush his lips against hers, a chaste, formal gesture. But the moment his mouth touched hers, a spark ignited. Her lips were soft, hesitant, and he felt the shiver that ran through her. It was not a kiss of passion, but it was laden with 1,000 unspoken things: fear, hope, gratitude, and a terrifying, burgeoning tenderness. It was brief, lasting only a second, but it changed everything. When he pulled back, the air between them was thick with the new reality of their bond. They were no longer just allies. They were husband and wife. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Certificate signed," he said, handing the document to Caleb. "You're official. I'd advise you head back to your homestead, Thorne, and keep your rifle handy." The ride back to the cabin was even quieter than the journey to town, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the heavy, uncertain silence of a newly married couple who knew nothing about each other and yet had just pledged everything. Eliza's hands were once again at Caleb's waist, but this time, the gesture felt proprietary. She was his wife. He was her husband. When they reached the cabin, the moon was high, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. The small log structure looked less like a fortress now and more like a home. Their home. Caleb helped her down from the horse, his hands steady on her arms. They stood before the door for a moment, the threshold representing a new and daunting frontier. Inside was a single room, a single bed. The practicalities of their arrangement, which had seemed so distant in the justice's office, were now starkly immediate. "I can sleep by the fire," Caleb said gruffly, breaking the silence. "You take the bed." Eliza looked at him, at the tension in his jaw, the careful distance he was trying to put between them. She thought of her condition. A real marriage. A partnership. That did not mean she would force an intimacy he was not ready for, but it also meant she would not allow them to continue as warden and prisoner. "No," she said softly. "You will not sleep on the floor of your own home." "Caleb," she took a steadying breath. "It is a large bed. We are adults. We can share it." Her directness caught him off guard. He looked from her determined face to the single bed inside and felt a fresh wave of panic. Sharing a bed with her seemed infinitely more dangerous than facing down Barrett's hired guns. It was an intimacy his solitary soul recoiled from, even as another, deeper part of him craved it. But he saw the resolve in her eyes. She was holding him to their bargain. A partnership. Equals. He gave a short, jerky nod. All right. That night, they lay side by side in the darkness, stiff as corpses, a gulf of wool blankets between them. Neither slept. They listened to the sound of each other's breathing, acutely aware of every rustle of the bedding, every shift in weight. For Caleb, her proximity was a torment. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair on the pillow. He could feel the warmth radiating from her body across the small space that separated them. He lay on his back, staring at the log ceiling, his hands fisted at his sides, fighting a battle within himself more fierce than any he had fought in the war. For Eliza, the fear was mixed with a strange sense of peace. She was married. She was, in the eyes of the law, safe. She lay beside a man who felt as dangerous as a slumbering wolf. Yet she knew, with an instinct she could not explain, that he would not harm her. She felt the tension in him, the rigid control he was exerting, and it was, in its own way, a comfort. He was a man who honored his word, even the parts that terrified him. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed her, and she drifted off, her last conscious thought being the strange, undeniable truth that she had never felt safer in her life. The calm held for 3 days. It was a fragile, temporary peace, a breath held before the plunge. Caleb and Eliza moved around each other with a new, heightened awareness. The titles of husband and wife were unspoken between them, yet they colored every interaction. When he passed her a cup of coffee, his fingers brushed hers, and they both drew back as if burned. When she laid out his dinner, the simple domestic act felt freighted with a new, profound significance. The nights were the worst. They continued to share the bed, a silent testament to the pact she had insisted upon. They lay inches apart, the space between them a canyon of unspoken feelings and unresolved tension. Caleb would lie awake for hours, listening to her soft breathing, his body rigid with a longing so intense it was a physical pain. He wanted to reach across that small divide, to pull her to him, to feel the reality of her beside him. But he was held back by a lifetime of reserve and the fear that touching her would unleash something inside him he could not control. On the 4th day after their return from Clearwater, the inevitable happened. Caleb was splitting wood near the edge of the clearing when he saw them. 3 riders, picking their way up the trail. The man in the lead was not a hired thug. He was dressed in a fine, city-made black coat and hat, and he sat his expensive horse with an air of arrogant ownership. Even from a distance, Caleb could feel the man's malevolent purpose. It was Judge Alistair Barrett. Caleb lowered his axe, his heart settling into a cold, heavy rhythm. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for it. He strode back to the cabin. "He's here," he said to Eliza, his voice grim. Barrett. Eliza, who had been cleaning the breakfast dishes, froze. All the color drained from her face. "What do we do?" "You stay inside. You lock the door. You don't open it for anyone but me," he commanded. He took the rifle down from its pegs above the mantel. He checked the action, his movements swift and sure. He then grabbed the signed and witnessed marriage certificate from the small wooden box, where he kept his important papers, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "This is my fight now, Eliza. He has no business with you." He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. He did not take cover. He stood in the open, the rifle held loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. It was a statement. "This is my land. You are not welcome here." Barrett and his 2 men reined in, just as the others had done. The judge's face was smooth, unlined, and utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes were like chips of obsidian as they swept over Caleb, dismissing him as nothing more than an obstacle. "You must be the squatter my men told me about," Barrett said, his voice cultured and dripping with condescension. "I am Judge Alistair Barrett. I have come for my property, a woman named Eliza Wentworth. She is a runaway, indebted to my estate. I have a warrant for her retrieval." He produced a piece of paper, waving it dismissively. Caleb's gaze did not waver. "There's no one here by that name." Barrett's thin lips tightened into a cruel smile. "Let's not play games, my good man. My men tracked her to this very cabin. I know she is in there. Hand her over, and I will be on my way. I might even forget to have the territorial marshal look into your claim on this land." It was a threat and a bribe, all in one. Caleb felt a cold rage build inside him. "The only woman in that cabin is my wife," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Eliza Thorne." Barrett's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. "Your wife? Do you take me for a fool? She has been missing for less than 2 weeks. We were married 4 days ago, in Clearwater," Caleb said, pulling the certificate from his pocket. He held it up, signed by Justice Henderson, witnessed by Sheriff Angus Brody. "It's all legal. Now, I'll thank you to get off my land." Barrett stared at the paper, then at Caleb's unyielding face. He was momentarily thwarted, his legal instrument rendered useless by a stronger one. But he was not a man accustomed to being denied. His eyes narrowed, the civilized mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "A clever trick," he hissed. "A marriage of convenience. It changes nothing. She belongs to me. I will have her back, one way or another." He turned his venomous gaze toward the cabin door. "Eliza, I know you can hear me. Do not think this rustic brute can protect you from me. You will be mine." Suddenly, the cabin door flew open. Eliza stood there, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with defiance. She held Caleb's heavy shotgun, its twin barrels pointed squarely at Barrett's chest. "I am not your property, Alistair," she said, her voice ringing with a strength Caleb had never heard before. "And this rustic brute is my husband. Now do as he says and leave." Barrett was momentarily shocked into silence by her appearance, by the sight of the shotgun in her hands. His face contorted with rage. "You foolish girl. You think this is over?" He looked from Eliza to Caleb, his eyes promising retribution. He gestured to his men. "We're leaving. For now." He wheeled his horse around and galloped back down the trail, his men scrambling to follow. Caleb stood frozen for a moment, the rifle still in his hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and a fierce, soaring pride. She had stood with him. She had called him her husband. She had faced down the monster from her past. Just as the riders were about to disappear around a bend, one of Barrett's men twisted in his saddle and fired a single, spiteful shot back towards the cabin. It was a gesture of pure malice. Caleb reacted instantly, shoving Eliza back inside the doorway as the bullet slammed into the log frame where her head had been moments before. The shot echoed through the valley, a declaration of war. The legal maneuvering was over. The violence had begun. Caleb slammed the door and barred it, his face a grim mask. "He'll be back," he said, his voice tight, "and he won't be bringing warrants next time." The air in the cabin was thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. Adrenaline gave way to a chilling certainty. Barrett's retreat was not a defeat. It was a regrouping. The final showdown was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. Caleb moved with a grim, methodical purpose, transforming the cabin back into a fortress. He barred the heavy wooden shutters over the windows, plunging the room into a dim, firelit twilight. He checked his rifle and shotgun again, laying out extra cartridges on the table. He was back in the war, his mind sharp and clear, calculating firing angles and defensive positions. Eliza watched him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. The shotgun still felt heavy and alien in her hands, but seeing Caleb's focused calm, his absolute competence, steadied her. She had not been a passive victim. She had stood her ground. She had taken up a weapon. She was a part of this fight now, a partner in truth. "What will he do?" she asked, her voice quiet. "He won't come alone," Caleb said, not looking up from his task. He'll bring enough men to storm the place. He thinks he can overwhelm us. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes intense. He's underestimating us. The gun hung in the air, a solid binding thing. Eliza nodded, setting the shotgun down and beginning to gather supplies. Water, bandages from her small travel kit, anything she thought they might need. They worked in tandem, a silent, efficient team preparing for a siege. The wait was the worst part. Every creak of the logs, every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. They sat in the dim light, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Hours passed. Dusk began to fall, turning the narrow slits in the shutters from gray to black. He'll come after dark, Caleb predicted. He'll think it gives him an advantage. Just as full darkness enveloped the valley, they heard it. The muffled sound of multiple horses, moving carefully. Caleb took his position at one of the front window slits, his rifle ready. "Stay away from the door and windows," he ordered Eliza. She ignored him. She picked up the shotgun, her knuckles white, and took a position near the back window, the one that overlooked the steep slope behind the cabin. "I will not hide while you fight for me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "We are partners, Caleb." He glanced at her, a flicker of something, pride, fear for her, respect, in his eyes. He gave a sharp nod. "Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Make it count." The attack came with a sudden, chaotic rush. A volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin, the bullets thudding into the thick logs. A man shouted, "Thorne, give up the girl, and we'll let you live." Caleb answered with a single, carefully aimed rifle shot. A cry of pain from the darkness told him it had found its mark. The night erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. Caleb was a master of this kind of fighting. He was patient, disciplined. He fired sparingly, moving between the two front windows, making them think there was more than one rifleman inside. The darkness and his knowledge of the terrain were his allies. But there were at least 5 of them, and they were getting bolder, using the trees and rocks for cover as they crept closer. A bullet splintered the shutter near Caleb's face, showering him with wood fragments. He was pinned down, unable to cover both the front and the side of the cabin at once. Suddenly, a shot boomed from the back of the cabin. The roar of a shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. Eliza had seen a man trying to sneak around the side, using the woodpile for cover. Her shot, a wide blast of buckshot, had torn into the logs above his head, sending him scrambling back into the darkness. It was the diversion Caleb needed. He shifted to the side window and took down another of Barrett's men, who had been trying to get close enough to torch the roof. Barrett, enraged, screamed at his men to charge the door. 2 of them broke from cover, running low towards the porch. Caleb's rifle barked once, and the first man went down. But the second one was almost there, an axe in his hand, ready to splinter the door. Caleb tried to swing the rifle around for another shot, but his arm caught on the window frame. In that split second, a new sound cut through the chaos, the thunder of a galloping horse and a booming voice. "In the name of the law, drop your weapons." It was Sheriff Brody. He had been uneasy ever since the wedding. He knew Barrett's character, and his gut told him the trouble wasn't over. He had decided to ride out and check on the Thorns, arriving at the most critical moment. Barrett's remaining men, caught between the fortified cabin and a determined sheriff, hesitated. This wasn't a private feud anymore. It was an assault in front of a lawman. Barrett, insane with fury and the frustration of being thwarted again, lost all reason. "Kill them all," he shrieked, raising his own pistol to fire at the sheriff. But he never got the chance. Caleb, freed for a moment, fired through the window. His bullet struck Barrett square in the chest. The judge staggered back, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the snow. His reign of terror was over. Seeing their leader fall, the remaining hired guns threw down their weapons and raised their hands as Sheriff Brody bore down on them. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire within the cabin and the groans of the wounded man outside. Caleb leaned his forehead against the rough log wall, the rifle suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The tension drained out of him, leaving him trembling with exhaustion. It was over. He turned to look at Eliza. She was standing in the middle of the room, the shotgun lowered, her face smudged with gunpowder. She looked at him, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. They had survived. Together. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him. She buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with reaction. He could feel the frantic beating of her heart, or maybe it was his own. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, a grounding anchor in the chaotic aftermath. The threat was gone. The battle was won. And in the ruins of his solitude, something new and infinitely more precious had been forged. In the quiet aftermath of the gunfight, the world seemed to shrink to the 4 walls of the cabin. Sheriff Brody had dealt with the living and the dead, hauling Barrett's men off to the jail in Clearwater and making arrangements for the judge's body. He had clapped Caleb on the shoulder, given Eliza a respectful nod, and said, "You've got a good woman there, Thorne, and a fine, legal marriage. No one will trouble you again." Now, there was only the hiss of the fire and the sound of their breathing. Eliza was carefully cleaning a shallow graze on Caleb's forearm where a splinter had cut him. Her touch was gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness and an ocean of unspoken emotion between them. Caleb watched her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. He had spent years believing that strength was found in solitude, in self-reliance. But tonight, he had not been alone. Eliza had not cowered. She had stood with him, fought with him. Her courage had been a shield as real as the log walls around them. He had offered her a marriage of convenience, a legal fiction to protect her. But it had become something else entirely. The marriage, he said, his voice rough. When I proposed it, it was a practical solution. Eliza paused, her fingers stilling on his arm. She looked up, her eyes searching his. "I know, I was wrong," he continued, the words coming hard, wrenched from a place of deep, guarded emotion. "For me, standing there in that saloon, it was real. It was real from the moment I said the words. He looked at her, his soul bared in his gaze. And tonight, seeing you stand in that doorway, I knew I would rather die than let him take you." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, spilling over to trace paths through the gunpowder smudges on her cheeks. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered. She thought of her audacious condition, that their marriage must be real. She had set it out of pride and a desperate need for it not to be another transaction. She had never dreamed her own heart would so readily agree to the terms. "For me, too, from the beginning." He reached up, his callous thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The simple touch was an earthquake. It shattered the last of his walls, the final remnants of the fortress he had built around his heart. He leaned in, and this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He kissed her. It was not the chaste, questioning kiss from their wedding day. This was a kiss of desperation and relief, of gratitude and a deep, soul-shaking passion that had been simmering between them since that first night. It was a kiss that spoke of shared battles and future dawns, of 2 solitary souls finding their home in each other. Eliza melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with all the pent-up fear and hope and a love that had grown, fierce and resilient, in the most unlikely of places. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The cabin was no longer a refuge from the world. It was the center of it. 5 years later, the cabin was still there, but it was now the sturdy, warm heart of a much larger home. New wings, built from the same native logs by Caleb's own hands, stretched out on either side. A proper barn stood proud against the skyline, and a fine herd of Hereford cattle grazed peacefully in the lush meadow that sloped down to the creek. The Thorne Ranch was a thriving, prosperous place, a testament to years of hard work and shared dreams. Inside, the main room was filled with the late afternoon sun. A 4-year-old boy with his father's serious gray eyes and his mother's dark hair sat at the big kitchen table, painstakingly tracing letters on a slate. "That's a B, Sam," Eliza said, her voice soft. She sat beside him, her hand resting on her gently rounded stomach. A second child was on the way. For Boulder, like your papa's old horse, she had her school, after a fashion. For now, her student body consisted of one bright, curious boy, but she knew that would change as the valley slowly became home to more families. The door opened, and Caleb stepped inside. The years had been kind to him. The hard angles of his face had softened, and the haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still moved with the same economy of motion, but there was a new ease in his posture. He smiled as he saw his wife and son, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He came over and kissed Eliza, his hand coming to rest over hers on her belly. "All quiet on the Western Front?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "All quiet," she confirmed, leaning into his touch. "Sam has mastered the alphabet up to G." Caleb ruffled his son's hair. "Good work, soldier." He looked around the room, at the neat shelves Eliza kept, the colorful quilt she had made for their bed, the small stack of books on the mantelpiece next to the wooden comb he had carved so long ago. He had once believed happiness was an absence of pain, a quiet emptiness. He had been so wrong. Happiness was this: the warmth, the noise, the clutter of a life fully lived. Later that evening, after Sam was asleep, they stood on the porch together, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. Caleb wrapped his arms around Eliza from behind, pulling her back against his chest. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a habit they had perfected since their first days together. "Do you remember that first day?" he asked quietly, his chin resting on the top of her head. "The storm. I remember the cold," she said. "And then waking up here to the fire. Almost rode away," he confessed, the memory still sharp. "Almost left you there in the snow. It would have been easier, simpler." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. "But you didn't." "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't." He looked down at her, his wife, the mother of his children, the unshakable center of his world. "I thought you were a complication, a disruption to the peace I'd built." He shook his head, a small, wondering smile on his lips. "I had it all backward. The peace wasn't real. It was just quiet. You brought the life. You were the miracle I didn't even know I needed." He leaned down and kissed her, a soft, reverent kiss full of the quiet wonder of their shared history. Here, on the land he had once chosen for his solitude, he had found everything he had never dared to want.